Picture yourself crouched behind a marble column in a chamber where holiness should reign supreme. The Vatican's air is heavy with incense, sweet, cloying, sacred, but tonight it mingles with something far more dangerous. Shadows bend and ripple across gilded walls as candle flames lick against iron candelabras, casting a golden haze over figures who move not with reverence, but with reckless abandon. The year is 1501, a night when power, lust, and ambition intertwine in a spectacle that should never have been witnessed within Christendom's most sacred halls. You strain your ears and hear the soft rustle of silk dragging against cold stone, punctuated by laughter, playful, reckless, and utterly profane. These corridors once echoed with the footsteps of saints, monks, and martyrs, but tonight the sound is altogether different. A chorus of courtesans, cardinals, and noblemen entangled in something that even ancient Rome, decadent, corrupt, and shameless, might have considered excessive. Your heart hammers in your chest, as though trying to flee from the ribcage that traps it. You are not simply a witness. You are standing at the threshold of one of the darkest nights in papal history. A night whispered about for centuries. A night remembered as the infamous Banquet of the Chestnuts. The October air carries faint scents through the open balconies, the warmth of roasted chestnuts sold by vendors in the Roman streets below, mingling with perfumes imported from Venice and Andalusia. But here in the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, those chestnuts will become more than food. They will become symbols, props in a ritual of corruption that will sear itself into the collective memory of Renaissance Europe. The chamber itself glitters like a stage designed for a play about excess. Frescoes of ancient heroes and saints stare down from the walls, mute, painted witnesses to what is about to unfold. Velvet curtains sway faintly, and in the flickering light, courtesans, 50 of them, wait like jewels in a box, their silks shimmering, their smiles carefully rehearsed. Tonight they are not merely companions, they are instruments of power, arranged by Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, to entertain the highest and most dangerous men in Christendom. This is no ordinary party. This is a performance, a declaration of authority, a defilement of the sacred, wrapped in luxury and laughter. And when the night is done, it will stain not just the name of one family, but the very soul of the church. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Because as we step further into this story, you will see how Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, rose from the dust of Spain to the golden throne of Rome, and how the seeds of ambition, lust, and betrayal blossomed into the night that became his family's eternal curse. To understand how such a night of corruption could ever unfold within the Vatican, we must first return to the beginning, to a small Spanish town far from Rome's marble palaces and gilded altars. Rodrigo Borgia was born on January 1, 1431, in the town of Xàtiva, near Valencia. It was not a place of grandeur, but of dust and heat, where narrow streets twisted through stone houses and olive groves clung stubbornly to the dry earth. For most children born here, destiny meant a life of toil, measured in fields harvested and bread baked. But Rodrigo's life was not meant to follow the rhythms of peasants. He had been born into a family whose ambition would stretch across Europe. His uncle, Alonso de Borja, was already climbing the steep ladder of ecclesiastical power. A shrewd man of law and politics, Alonso navigated the church not as a shepherd of souls, but as a statesman cloaked in vestments. When Alonso rose to the papacy in 1455 as Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo's path was marked as if sealed in wax.
Nepotism was not an accident of the church. It was its bloodstream, and Rodrigo would drink deeply from it. At 25, Rodrigo was made cardinal deacon, not because of divine calling, but because his uncle's hand pushed him into the inner sanctum of power. Rome did not question such things too loudly. After all, nepotism was as common as prayer. Still, for Rodrigo, this was no mere appointment. It was an invitation to transform himself from an obscure Spaniard into one of the most formidable figures in Christendom. When he first arrived in Rome, he carried with him the air of a foreigner. The eternal city was overwhelming. The soaring arches of basilicas, the endless traffic of merchants, monks, and soldiers, the smell of incense mingled with sewage. Yet Rodrigo did not shrink from it. He absorbed it. He studied the way men bartered favors in darkened corners, how gold whispered louder than scripture, and how ambition, if sharpened like a blade, could cut through centuries of tradition. Those who met him in his early years often remarked on his presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed perpetually alive with hunger, not for food, but for opportunity. He learned quickly that Rome was less a holy city and more a stage, and Rodrigo intended to play the starring role. The church, to him, was not a sanctuary, but a machine of power. Offices, indulgences, even salvation itself could be bought and sold. And in this theater of corruption, Rodrigo was a natural actor. Each benefice he collected across Europe was like a carefully chosen jewel. Each mistress, banquet, and alliance was another thread in the web he spun around himself. He had seen enough of life to know that piety was a mask, easily worn and easily removed. Ambition, on the other hand, was permanent. The dust of Xàtiva clung to his childhood memories, but Rome would provide him marble halls and velvet drapes. He was no longer the boy from Spain. He was a man ready to bend the eternal city to his will. Already, even in his youth, there were whispers. Priests who lived in austerity saw in Rodrigo a dangerous kind of energy, charming, magnetic, but too willing to indulge. Pope Pius II would later chastise him for scandalous behavior in Siena, but Rodrigo had no intention of softening. Shame, he understood, was a luxury, and luxury, he believed, was his destiny. The stage was set. The young Spaniard had entered Rome not as a pilgrim, but as a conqueror. What began as family favor would soon grow into a dynasty of power, ambition, and vice. The boy from Xàtiva would become Alexander VI, remembered by history as the most corrupt pope ever to wear the tiara.
Rome, in the mid to late 15th century, was a city that seemed to live two lives at once. By daylight, pilgrims arrived at its gates with tears in their eyes, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers as they gazed upon the splendor of basilicas said to hold the bones of saints. In those hours, the eternal city seemed truly eternal, a place where heaven touched earth, where golden altars shimmered in candlelight, and where salvation seemed just a coin's toss away. But when the sun dipped behind the 7 hills, another Rome emerged, a darker Rome, a Rome where shadows stretched long across cobbled streets, where laughter and shouts echoed from taverns and brothels, where cardinals disguised their nightly excursions beneath velvet hoods. It was a city where prayers were traded by day and pleasures were sold by night. The contradiction was almost unbearable. In the morning, crowds would kneel in hushed reverence before gilded relics, the air heavy with incense and whispers of salvation. Yet at dusk, the very same streets became marketplaces for human flesh, where courtesans strutted openly and merchants counted their coins beside church walls. Rome was both holy and profane, a paradox that Dante himself might have recognized as a circle of hell hidden inside paradise. Rodrigo Borgia, still a cardinal then, understood this Rome better than most.
He was not scandalized by the hypocrisy, he thrived in it. He quickly saw that power in this city was not secured through prayer, but through gold and favors. Everything from salvation to bishoprics had its price. And Rodrigo knew how to buy. He spun his fortunes like a spider weaving a web, patient, calculating, methodical. Across Europe, he collected benefices, church revenues, positions and privileges, hoarding them like a merchant hoards precious stones. Each new title fattened his purse, each benefice tightened his grip on the machinery of the church. But Rodrigo's tastes were not those of a humble servant of God. His lifestyle rivaled that of princes and dukes. He built magnificent palaces adorned with frescoes and marble, hosted banquets where roasted peacocks were brought to table gilded in gold leaf, and surrounded himself with music, poetry, and dancers. He lived not as a shepherd of Christ's flock, but as a Renaissance lord, intoxicated by art, wealth, and desire. And he was never alone. His life was marked by a succession of mistresses, each one carefully chosen, each one drawn into his orbit of power. They were not simply women of beauty, they were women of influence, conduits of alliance, and bearers of his legacy. From them came children, many children, born with the regularity of seasonal harvests. These children were not shameful secrets. They were pawns, instruments Rodrigo would one day use to secure dynasties. To the outside world, his behavior was shocking. To Rome, it was a scandal. But scandals in that city were as common as bread at dawn. The more he indulged, the more whispers followed him, but the more firmly he entrenched himself in the network of power. Rodrigo had found the secret of Rome. Piety was performance, wealth was salvation, and ambition was the only true sacrament. While others prayed for heaven, Rodrigo prepared for empire. And it was through this pursuit of both desire and power that he would meet the woman who would forever change the course of his life, and through her bring into the world the children who would shape the dark destiny of the Borgia name. Among the many women who drifted in and out of Rodrigo Borgia's orbit, one stood apart, not merely for her beauty, but for her shrewdness, her patience, and her ability to survive within the dangerous currents of papal politics. Her name was Vannozza de' Catani, a Roman noblewoman of respectable birth, whose family ties offered Rodrigo both respectability and influence. Their union was no fleeting passion. For nearly a decade, from 1474 to 1482, she was his steady companion, and in that span she bore him 4 children who would later become infamous: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. These children were not hidden in shame, nor disowned in silence. Rodrigo, unlike other prelates who cloaked their indiscretions beneath false piety, embraced his offspring openly. They were not mistakes to be buried. They were pieces on a chessboard, destined to be moved and sacrificed in the pursuit of their father's grand ambition. Juan, the golden child, would be elevated to titles he scarcely earned. Cesare, sharp and restless, would soon prove himself both the most brilliant and the most dangerous of them all. Lucrezia, often reduced by history to a pawn or temptress, became a symbol of her family's entanglements, her life forever shaped by the bargains and betrayals of her father and brothers. And Joffre, the youngest, would be used to secure alliances through marriage long before he could even grasp the meaning of duty. Rodrigo viewed them not as children of the flesh, but as instruments of destiny. Each bore a future that he himself had drafted: dukedoms, marriages, bishoprics, alliances, crowns. The bloodline he cultivated with Vannozza was not one of tender fatherhood. It was a dynasty being forged, its future written in the careful ink of political calculation. Yet even in these early years, Rodrigo's conduct stirred outrage. His indiscretions were so open, so unapologetic, that they provoked comment even in a city where corruption was already common. In 1460, Pope Pius VIII had written him a scathing letter condemning his behavior in Siena, where his excesses had scandalized both court and town alike. To Pius, Rodrigo was a man in ecclesiastical garb, but driven by passions entirely unfit for the sacred office. The Pope's reprimand dripped with disapproval, but for Rodrigo, such words were meaningless. Shame was a currency he had long since stopped using. Rodrigo was not interested in the approval of his peers. He was interested in their obedience. Every scandal, every whispered story, every rumor of mistresses and illegitimate children was a burden others might have found crippling. For Rodrigo, it was proof of his audacity. He was daring enough to live without the mask. And audacity in Renaissance Rome was often rewarded. By the time his children were old enough to be useful, Rodrigo had already embedded himself so deeply in the machinery of the church that no scandal could unseat him. He was a man playing two games at once: the game of power within the Vatican and the game of legacy through his bloodline. With Vanozza's children as his pawns, he was preparing for moves that would shake Italy to its core. The year was 1492, and in Rome, the death of Pope Innocent VIII left the throne of St. Peter vacant. What should have been a solemn conclave of cardinals seeking divine guidance quickly revealed itself for what it truly was: a marketplace of power. Behind the doors of the Sistine Chapel, beneath frescoes that would one day bear Michelangelo's timeless visions, 23 cardinals gathered to choose Christ's vicar. But their prayers were drowned out by the quiet clink of gold coins and the whisper of promises. This was not a holy election. It was a transaction. Rodrigo Borgia, by now a seasoned cardinal of immense wealth and cunning, entered the conclave with ambition burning like a torch. For years he had maneuvered, collected benefices, and accumulated riches for this very moment. He understood what others pretended not to see: that the papacy could be bought, if one had enough gold and enough nerve. And Rodrigo had both. The air inside the chapel was heavy, not with incense, but with bargaining. Cardinals huddled in corners, voices low, striking deals for bishoprics, abbeys, and lucrative posts across Europe. Rodrigo moved through these chambers with the precision of a merchant at a fair, his offers calculated, his promises generous. Entire estates, castles, and lifelong pensions were bartered away in exchange for one thing: votes. By the time the ballots were cast, his victory was assured. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI. His election achieved through a practice so openly corrupt that contemporaries did not even bother to deny it. They called it by its true name: simony, the buying and selling of holy offices. The shepherd of Christendom had purchased his flock. And yet, Rome rejoiced. To the citizens of the Eternal City, Alexander was no stranger. They had grown accustomed to the Spaniard's presence, his energy, his magnificence. He was foreign by birth, but Roman by appetite, and the people anticipated that his pontificate would bring splendor. That night, the city erupted in celebration. Bonfires lit the 7 hills. Torchlight processions wound through ancient streets. Triumphal arches rose as if the glory of Rome had been reborn in this new pope. The coronation on August 26th was an event of unprecedented grandeur. St. Peter's Basilica swelled with voices, trumpets blared, and chroniclers recorded the thunderous ovation as the greatest ever given to a pontiff. To many, it seemed that divine providence had placed on the papal throne a man of vigor and vision, capable of restoring Rome's greatness. And at first, Alexander played the part well. He moved quickly to restore order in a city plagued by violence. Rome had been drowning in blood, with assassinations numbering in the hundreds within mere months. He established districts overseen by magistrates empowered to police the streets and impose justice. He held audiences every Tuesday, listening to grievances and dispensing judgments with efficiency that astonished observers. For a brief and fragile moment, even his critics admitted he seemed the right man for the papacy. But power, like strong wine, does not create character. It reveals it. And Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, was a man whose character had been forged not by prayer, but by appetite. His vision of the papacy was not one of humility or spiritual renewal, but of dynasty. The throne of St. Peter was not in his eyes a sacred burden. It was a crown meant to be passed not to successors chosen by God, but to his own bloodline. Thus began a reign where every gesture of reform would be overshadowed by a darker truth, that the Pope of Rome, supreme shepherd of Christendom, had turned the Church into the stage for one family's relentless ambition.
From the moment Rodrigo Borgia crowned himself Alexander VI, it was clear where his heart lay, not in the salvation of souls, but in the elevation of his children. The papacy, in his hands, became not a spiritual throne, but a family enterprise. Every appointment, every alliance, every coin gathered in the Vatican treasury was measured against the question, how could it serve his dynasty? His eldest son, Juan, was showered with honors. Alexander made him Duke of Gandia in Spain and arranged his marriage to a cousin of the Spanish king. The boy's character mattered little. It was the prestige of his title that shone in the Borgia tapestry. Juan was to be the golden son, the one who would carry the family's nobility across kingdoms. But if Juan was the heart, Cesare was the mind. At only 18 years of age, Cesare was given one of the most prestigious archbishoprics in Christendom, Valencia. Soon after, he was elevated to the College of Cardinals. To the Church, he was a rising cleric. To his father, he was a weapon disguised in scarlet robes. Cesare never hid his disdain for the Tassoc. His talents, sharp, cunning, and merciless, were not suited for sermons or scripture, but for swords and strategy. Yet Alexander forced him into holy orders, a role that Cesare would one day cast aside with the audacity of a conqueror. The Pope's daughters, too, were pawns. Lucrezia, barely more than a girl, was drawn into a series of marriages meant to bind the Borgias to Italy's most powerful families. Each time politics shifted, her alliances were broken and reforged, as though her body were a treaty written in flesh and blood. Humphrey, the youngest, was married off to secure southern alliances, little more than a boy used as bait in the web of Italian politics. Yet these machinations were not conducted in secrecy. The Vatican of Alexander VI was no monastery, but a theater of power, and its actors played their roles openly. The papal apartments swelled with banquets, music, and laughter. Nights stretched long, filled with spectacles that blurred the line between courtly entertainment and scandalous indulgence. At the center of this spectacle moved a woman whose presence shocked Rome more than most, Julia Farnese, Alexander's mistress, known across the city as Julia la Bella. Her beauty was legendary: golden hair, luminous skin, a face praised as angelic. But her angel's form walked freely through Vatican corridors, entering chambers where no mistress of a pope should ever be seen. She was not hidden away, but displayed like a jewel, a living defiance of vows trampled underfoot. For the people of Rome, this was both mesmerizing and appalling. Never had papal hypocrisy been so brazen. Yet Alexander seemed untouchable, protected by wealth, influence, and the machinery of fear he spun around himself.
The papal palace, once a symbol of holiness, had transformed into a stage where the sacred and profane performed an obscene ballet. Cardinals supped beside courtesans, sacred offices were handed out like favors at a banquet, and the children of Alexander VI, whether dressed in velvet or crimson robes, were paraded not as innocent offspring, but as instruments of dynasty. The Pope had made his choice clear. He would rule not as a guardian of the Church, but as a patriarch of the Borgias, and through his children he intended to carve the family name into the bedrock of history, even if it meant sacrificing the very soul of Christendom to do it.
Amid this world of power, scandal, and spectacle, there was one man who neither belonged fully to the world of cardinals nor to the whispering crowd of servants, a man whose pen would one day ensure that the excesses of the Borgia court could never be buried in silence. His name was Johann Burchard. Born around 1450 in Alsace, far from the thunder of Roman politics, Burchard was a man of law and ceremony. He studied canon law with the precision of the jurist, but his true gift was not in argument, it was in observation. He was meticulous, dry, a recorder of details that others ignored. Where most men embellished, Burchard reduced. Where others exaggerated, he merely noted. This sobriety, this refusal to indulge and flourish, would later give his writings the weight of undeniable truth. By 1483, he had risen through the church to hold a peculiar post, Master of Ceremonies to the Pope. It was a role that seemed modest, but in reality it was a key that unlocked every chamber of papal life. The Master of Ceremonies was responsible for ensuring that rituals, processions, and solemnities ran without flaw. But to perform this duty, he needed to stand everywhere. In the Sistine Chapel during conclaves, beside the Pope at coronations, in the papal apartments during feasts, and even within the private spaces where the pontiff's secrets lay hidden. Burchard, therefore, became both indispensable and invisible. He was trusted because he seemed harmless, a man who cared only for order and protocol. Cardinals confided in him about liturgical matters, often forgetting his presence when their conversations strayed into corruption. Ambassadors and noblemen overlooked him as they bargained in whispers. He was like the shadow of a candle, always present, never noticed. Yet, all the while, he was writing. Burchard kept a diary he called the Liber Notarum, a day-by-day account of ceremonies and events he witnessed. At first glance, his record seemed lifeless. Who entered a procession, which hymn was sung, which relic was displayed. But nestled among these details are the scandals, the grotesque spectacles, the sins of popes. He recorded orgies and murders with the same flat tone as he noted the carrying of a cross or the lighting of a candle. This detachment, almost accountant-like, made his testimony impossible to dismiss. It was not that Burchard hated Alexander VI or his family. If anything, he seemed indifferent to them. But he was obsessed with accuracy, with preserving a true account of events no matter how damning. In doing so, he created the single most important record of papal corruption in the Renaissance, one that even centuries later would trouble the Vatican. He was in essence the unwilling mirror held up to the Borgias' faces. They could laugh, scheme, and indulge, but in the shadows, Burchard's pen was moving, silent, and unstoppable. And it was this silent chronicler who would preserve the memory of the most scandalous evening of Alexander's reign, the Banquet of Chestnuts. Without him, the story might have faded into rumor. With him, it became immortal.
By the late 1490s, the glow of the Borgia name had begun to tarnish under the weight of its own excess. Of Alexander's children, Juan, his eldest and most favored son, was the one meant to embody the family's nobility. He had been made Duke of Gandia, married into Spanish royalty, and paraded as the golden heir. But behind the glittering facade lay rot. Juan was reckless. Stories spread across Rome of his cruelty towards servants, his arrogance in council, and his appetite for women that rivaled even his father's. His military career was a disaster. Entrusted with command, he lacked discipline and skill. His campaigns marked not by glory, but by humiliation. He was a liability to the Borgias, though Alexander, blinded by paternal devotion, refused to see it. Then came the night of June 14, 1497. Juan attended a feast at the home of his mother, Venosa, and afterward departed into the Roman streets with a handful of companions. But when dawn broke, he did not return. Whispers spread quickly. The Duke of Gandia, the Pope's beloved son, had vanished. 2 days later, his body was dragged from the Tiber River. His throat had been cut. His body bore 9 deep wounds, stabs delivered with cold precision, each one a mark of rage or vengeance. Whoever had killed him had done so not in haste, but with certainty. Rome trembled. When Alexander was told, the mask of the mighty pontiff fell away. For 3 days and nights he shut himself in, refusing food, refusing company, weeping like a broken man. This was not the calculating pope who had bartered his way into power. This was a grieving father, crushed beneath the weight of loss. To those who saw him then, it seemed as though divine justice had finally struck the Borgias. In his grief, Alexander announced sweeping reforms. He spoke of stripping away luxury from the papal court, of suppressing simony and concubinage, of purifying the church that had become so diseased. He convened a commission of cardinals and canonists to draft ordinances, measures that would foreshadow reforms of the Council of Trent decades later. For a moment, Rome held its breath. Perhaps tragedy had carved humility into the Borgia Pope. Perhaps suffering had turned him from ambition to repentance. But grief in Alexander was as fleeting as reform in Rome. Within months, the ordinances were shelved, buried beneath layers of neglect. The Pope's sorrow cooled into anger, and his eyes turned toward his surviving children. He had been his heart, but Cesare, brilliant, merciless, and unshakable, would now become his sword. And while Rome whispered about the murder, no one dared to speak too loudly of the suspicion that lingered, that Juan's killer might not have been some nameless enemy, but someone much closer. Some pointed fingers at rival families like the Orsini. Others whispered darker suspicions, that Cesare himself, jealous of his brother's titles, had orchestrated the murder. Burchard, ever precise, recorded the events without speculation, but the silence in his words was heavy. The truth of Juan's death remains buried in the Tiber, its waters long since carried away, but its impact was unmistakable. It hardened Alexander, unleashed Cesare, and set the Borgias on a path where ambition would devour any last trace of restraint.
If Juan's death carved grief into Alexander's soul, it also cleared the path for another son, one whose ambition burned far brighter. Cesare Borgia had always been different. Where Juan was favored and pampered, Cesare was calculating, restless, and unnervingly aware of his own destiny. From childhood, Cesare had been marked for the church. He wore the cassock, held bishoprics, and even at 18 was made Archbishop of Valencia. Soon after, he entered the College of Cardinals. Outwardly, he appeared to follow his father's command, but beneath the scarlet robes lay a man who despised the altar. Cesare was not made for prayer, he was made for power. In 1498, he shocked Christendom. With a boldness unheard of, Cesare resigned his cardinal's hat, the first man in history to voluntarily cast off the sacred office. The act sent ripples across Europe. Cardinals were meant to die in their robes, their loyalty chained to the church until their last breath. But Cesare broke that chain, tearing away the pretense of piety to reveal his true ambition, not to serve God, but to rule men. The timing was perfect. France's new king, Louis XII,
required papal approval to annul his marriage and wed Anne of Brittany. Alexander saw an opportunity. In exchange for his blessing, the Pope demanded favors for his son. Cesare was released from his cardinalship, granted a noble French title, and married Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre, alliances that clothed him in legitimacy. More importantly, Louis XII gave him command of French troops. With them, Cesare would carve out a kingdom in Italy. His campaigns began with a ferocity that startled even seasoned generals. He swept across the Romagna, seizing towns and fortresses with a blend of cunning, intimidation, and ruthless violence. He negotiated with treachery, promised safety, and then betrayed without hesitation. Those who opposed him were crushed. Those who submitted were bound to him with gold and fear. Even his enemies admitted his brilliance. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and political thinker, observed Cesare closely during these years. What he saw astonished him. Here was a man who embodied the very essence of power, merciless when necessary, generous when it served him, always strategic, always a step ahead. Years later, Machiavelli would immortalize Cesare in The Prince, holding him up as the perfect model of a ruler, cold, efficient, unburdened by morality. But Cesare's rise was not merely his own. Behind him loomed the figure of Alexander VI, pouring the wealth of the papacy into his son's campaigns. Every indulgence sold, every office auctioned, every coin gathered from across Christendom was transformed into steel, horses, and soldiers for Cesare. Rome itself felt the drain, its spiritual treasury emptied to feed one man's march across Italy. And yet, to those watching, Cesare seemed unstoppable. He was young, handsome, magnetic, a commander who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. In his presence, men either bent the knee or fell by the sword. Where one had failed, Cesare triumphed. Where one had been a liability, Cesare was an empire in motion. For Alexander, it seemed a vindication. He had lost a son to the river, but gained in Cesare a sword sharp enough to cut Italy into pieces for the Borgias to rule. And as father and son grew ever more entwined in this pursuit of domination, the Vatican itself became less a holy palace and more the beating heart of a family empire, a place where salvation was sold to fund conquests, and where the Pope himself became little more than the banker of his son's ambition.
Caesar's conquests dazzled Italy, but wars are not won with brilliance alone. They are won with coin, endless coin. And for that, Alexander VI turned the papacy into a treasury not of faith, but of blood and gold. The Pope had already transformed Rome into a marketplace of salvation. Now, under the pressure of financing Caesar's armies, the trade grew shameless. Indulgences, the promise of forgiveness for sins, were sold more aggressively than ever before. Priests and friars fanned out across Christendom, preaching that one could shorten purgatory with silver. The faithful, frightened for their souls, emptied their purses, not realizing that their alms were not repairing churches or feeding the poor, but arming Caesar's mercenaries. Bishoprics and abbeys, once meant as spiritual callings, became commodities. Wealthy families purchased them for their sons, boys who often had no interest in prayer but every interest in prestige. The most brazen sales were for cardinals' hats, which Alexander bestowed on those who could pay a fortune in ducats. Over the course of his reign, he appointed 47 new cardinals, an expansion not of holiness, but of revenue. Each appointment filled the papal coffers, and those coffers in turn filled Caesar's war chest. Rome began to feel less like the capital of Christendom and more like a city under occupation by its own rulers. The Borgias treated the Papal States as a family kingdom, Alexander as patriarch, Caesar as crown prince, and the rest as pawns to be married, manipulated, or discarded. None suffered this role more visibly than Lucrezia.
To her father and brother, she was not a daughter or sister, but a treaty wrapped in silk. Her marriages were arranged with ruthless calculation, first to Giovanni Sforza, annulled on the grounds of impotence when the alliance soured, then to Alfonso of Aragon. A match of convenience soon ended in blood. Alfonso was strangled in 1500, his death widely attributed to Caesar's command. For the Borgias, Lucrezia's heart mattered little. What mattered was the signature her body could seal between rival dynasties. While the Vatican itself became a carnival of opulence, the papal apartments rang with music, laughter, and the clatter of feasts that stretched long into the night. Courtiers, cardinals, and foreign envoys gathered at Alexander's table, where roasted meats, exotic wines, and rare fruits dazzled the senses. But behind the gilded spectacle lay a trap. To dine with Alexander was to compromise oneself. Cardinals who joined his revelries found themselves implicated in his sins, their silence purchased by indulgences. Those who refused his invitations risked marking themselves as enemies, and enemies of the Borgias rarely lived long. What had begun as ambition was becoming tyranny. The sacred office of the papacy was no longer even disguised as holy. It was an engine of war, a forge of dynastic dreams, a palace where the line between salvation and corruption blurred until it vanished entirely. And yet, for all its depravity, the Borgia grip on Rome only tightened. Each coin bought another soldier, each soldier another conquest, each conquest another step toward a kingdom carved from Italy itself. But ambition always demands a price, and soon the lavish halls of the Vatican would host not just feasts and intrigues, but spectacles so shocking that they would forever stain the name of the Borgias and cast shadows over the church itself.
By the turn of the new century, the Vatican no longer resembled the austere court of Christ's successor. Under Alexander VI, it had transformed into something closer to a Renaissance theater, lavish, decadent, and dangerous. The sacred halls of St. Peter's now hosted a choreography of power, where every feast, every mask, every whispered intrigue was part of a performance directed by the Pope himself. Banquets spilled across the papal apartments in glittering display. Servants moved like dancers, balancing platters piled high with roasted boar, candied fruits, and gilded pastries shaped like crowns. Musicians filled the chambers with viols and flutes, while poets recited verses written not for God, but for pleasure. It was not unusual to see ambassadors from France or Spain seated beside Rome's most notorious courtesans, their laughter echoing off frescoed ceilings, painted with saints who seemed to watch in silent dismay. But these entertainments were never mere indulgence. They were tools. Alexander understood that feasting was a form of politics, and he wielded it as shrewdly as any army. To attend his table was to be bound to him. Cardinals who indulged in his revelries were compromised, their silence bought by complicity. How could they later condemn him when they themselves had drunk from the same cup, touched the same women, and laughed beneath the same painted ceilings? At the same time, the Pope used exclusion as a weapon. Those who refused his invitations, those who attempted to keep their dignity intact, found themselves marked as adversaries. And in the Rome of the Borgias, adversaries lived precarious lives. Some fell into disgrace, stripped of benefices. Others found themselves mysteriously ill, or their bodies discovered in alleyways by the Tiber. The Vatican was no longer simply the seat of the Church. It was a court of survival, where every gesture carried consequence. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, glided through this stage like its star actress. Known as Julia la Bella, her beauty was so extraordinary that Romans said it rivaled the Madonnas painted by Raphael. But unlike Raphael's serene canvases, Julia's presence scandalized Rome. She appeared openly at Vatican banquets, her hand resting on the arm of the Pope as though he were not Christ's vicar, but her consort.
Some said Alexander even commissioned her likeness in holy artworks, allowing her face to appear as the Virgin Mary, a blasphemy whispered with awe and horror alike. And yet, for all the outrage, few dared to resist. The Borgias had wrapped their corruption in spectacle so grand that it became nearly untouchable. The sacred and the profane danced together in candlelight, and those who stepped onto that stage found themselves trapped, unable to leave without consequence. Rome itself became complicit. Merchants thrived from the Pope's extravagance. Artists flourished under Borgia patronage. Soldiers ate from the Vatican treasury. Even ordinary Romans, scandalized as they were, gathered in streets to watch papal processions funded by the very indulgences sold for Caesar's wars. Hypocrisy hung over the eternal city like incense too thick to breathe. The Vatican was no longer a sanctuary. It was a theater, and like all theaters, it was moving steadily toward its climactic act, a performance so scandalous, so unforgettable, that it would echo across centuries.
By the autumn of 1501, the Borgias stood at the very summit of their power. Cesare had carved the Romagna into submission, a patchwork of lordships stitched into his personal domain. His name carried fear across Italy. To some, he was the devil's lieutenant. To others, the perfect prince who embodied both brilliance and cruelty. Even Machiavelli, who had witnessed his campaigns firsthand, could not help but admire him. Alexander VI, too, had weathered storms that might have broken lesser pontiffs. The French invasion under Charles VIII had shaken Italy, yet the Pope survived it. The endless feuds with noble families like the Orsini and Colonna had tested him, but he remained standing. The Jubilee of 1500 had poured wealth into Rome as pilgrims from across Christendom swarmed the city, filling both the papal treasury and, as more cynical observers noted, the city's brothels. The Borgias had transformed the papacy into their family empire. Alexander reigned as patriarch, Cesare commanded as warlord, and Lucrezia was reshaped into a living treaty, her marriages securing alliances as fragile and fleeting as the ink of papal decrees. Even Geoffrey, the youngest, was pressed into service, his life entangled in dynastic games far beyond his years. Yet with triumph came rot. Rome, drenched in spectacle, reeked of both incense and corruption. The streets gleamed with processions, torch-lit parades, and triumphal arches erected to honor victories. But behind the facade, whispers grew louder. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters home describing a court where sacred vows meant nothing, where mistresses walked beside bishops, and where salvation itself had a price tag. Alexander himself seemed intoxicated by success. His banquets grew ever more extravagant, his entertainments more daring, his appetite for both power and pleasure insatiable. Those around him played along, for to resist was dangerous. Cardinals indulged in excesses to avoid suspicion. Nobles turned a blind eye to depravity, so long as their pockets were lined. And foreign dignitaries, though scandalized, could not help but attend the spectacles, for within them lay access to papal favor. And yet, the very scale of this magnificence bred arrogance. The Borgias had come to believe themselves untouchable, their powers so entrenched that no scandal could unseat them. It was within this atmosphere, half triumph, half decay, that Cesare Borgia conceived the idea for an entertainment unlike any Rome had ever seen. It would be remembered as the Banquet of the Chestnuts.
The date was October 31st, 1501, All Hallows' Eve, a night when in the medieval imagination, the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. It was a night of prayer for departed souls, of solemn vigils, of bells tolling in shadowed chapels. But in the Vatican, the Borgias gave it another meaning.
Whether by coincidence or design, the symbolism was perfect. While Rome's faithful lit candles for their dead, Cesare Borgia prepared to host a spectacle that would extinguish whatever remained of papal dignity. The setting was his private apartments in the Apostolic Palace, lavish rooms frescoed by Pinturicchio, where scenes of saints and classical gods adorned the walls. Those painted figures, meant to embody virtue and divine order, would gaze down in eternal silence on acts that mocked both heaven and antiquity alike. The guest list itself was a proclamation of power. Cardinals who should have spent the evening in prayer arrived instead in velvet robes, their rings glittering under candlelight. Roman nobles came, eager to flatter the Pope's son and fearful of offending him by absence. Ambassadors from foreign courts attended too, their duty to observe outweighing their disgust. For them, the banquet was not only entertainment, it was intelligence. To watch Cesare was to glimpse the future of Italy. But the true centerpiece of the night was not the nobles or clerics. It was the 50 courtesans Cesare had assembled for the evening's pleasure. These were not common prostitutes dragged from the alleys of Rome. They were women of refinement, trained in the art of discretion, adorned in silks and jewels, each carefully chosen to please powerful men. Many had attended papal feasts before. They knew the rules, the rewards, and the dangers. As the guests arrived, the Vatican apartments glittered with candlelight. Servants poured wine from the papal cellars, vintages aged in Roman caves. Tables sagged beneath roasted meats, spiced fowl, sugared fruits, and confections molded into shapes of crowns and crosses. At first it seemed like any other of Alexander's banquets. Music filled the air, laughter rippled among the courtiers, and conversation turned to politics, war, and patronage of the arts. But beneath the surface, anticipation simmered. Everyone knew this night would not end with music and feasting alone. Something darker, more extraordinary was about to unfold. And in the shadows of the chamber, unnoticed as ever, stood Johann Burckhardt, the master of ceremonies, quill in hand, prepared to record. His pen had already captured coronations, councils, and wars. Tonight, it would capture a scandal so grotesque that centuries later, even hardened historians would hesitate to believe it. The banquet had begun.
As the feast wound down and the final platters were carried away, the atmosphere shifted. The music grew heavier, the laughter louder, and the scent of wine, rich, spiced, intoxicating, hung thick in the chamber. Servants cleared tables, but not for more food. They placed the heavy candelabras on the floor, scattering points of light across the vast room so that shadows stretched like fingers across marble tiles. Then, in a moment that burned itself into history, the chestnuts were brought in. Roasted chestnuts, humble tokens of autumn, were cast onto the ground in heaps. Their hard shells cracked against the stone floor, rolling into the pools of candlelight. The courtesans, 50 in number, clothed at first in silks that shimmered like spilled wine, were ordered to strip away their garments. Piece by piece, fabric fell to the floor, until bare flesh glowed in the flickering light. At Caesar's command, the women began to crawl on hands and knees, chasing chestnuts across the marble, their bodies arched and twisted, glistening under candlelight, a grotesque parody of innocence turned into performance. The guests, men of the cloth and men of power, watched with rapt attention. Some clapped, others laughed, while others leaned forward with faces caught between fascination and shame. And at the center, seated in a place of honor, watched Pope Alexander VI himself, the vicar of Christ, dressed in rich robes, eyes gleaming in the firelight. At his side, Cesare, his dark gaze commanding the spectacle, and Lucrezia, the Pope's daughter, whose presence at such a gathering has haunted historians ever since? Was she complicit, hardened by years of being used as a pawn in her family's schemes? Or was she trapped, a silent witness to the degradation of her father's papacy? The sources do not agree, but all concur she was there. The evening descended further still. As Burchard later recorded in his dry, unforgiving Latin, the men were encouraged to compete, to prove who among them could sleep with the greatest number of women. Prizes were prepared: silken tunics, shoes, barrettes, luxury items fit for nobles. Servants kept tally, as though counting coin, transforming lust into spectacle, sin into entertainment. The Vatican itself had become a brothel. It was obscene. Even in Renaissance Italy, a world not unfamiliar with excess, this crossed boundaries that seemed unimaginable. Ancient Rome's feasts of decadence, whispered about in moral sermons, suddenly had a rival within the very heart of Christendom. And all the while, Johann Burchard observed. His pen scratched down details with the same cold precision he used to describe coronations or processions. There was no flourish, no exaggeration, only fact. The crawling of the courtesans, the scattering of chestnuts, the tally of conquests. A chronicle so scandalous that centuries later, when the Vatican archives were opened, even Pope Leo XIII hesitated to let scholars read it, fearful that the truth would blacken the Church's name forever. By dawn, the candles had burned low, their wax pooling like spilled blood across the marble. The chestnuts had been gathered, the courtesans dismissed, the prizes claimed. Rome would awaiting to a new day, its pilgrims kneeling at altars, its priests chanting Mass. But beneath the marble floors of the apostolic palace, the echoes of laughter and moans lingered, staining the Vatican walls like smoke that cannot be scrubbed away. It would be called forever after the Banquet of Chestnuts.
The morning after the Banquet of Chestnuts, Rome seemed unchanged. Pilgrims shuffled into St. Peter's Basilica with candles in hand, whispering prayers for the dead. Cardinals carried out their official duties, attending councils and receiving envoys. And Alexander VI himself appeared in public with the same papal gravitas, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But beneath the calm surface, the city was already aflame with whispers. Servants, guards, and minor officials carried stories of the night through the streets. Courtesans who had taken part spoke in hushed tones to their confidants, and foreign ambassadors, sworn to report everything of importance, dispatched letters across Europe, their words heavy with both shock and fascination. What they described was not rumor, but corroborated scandal. Diplomats in Venice, Florence, and Paris wrote of the Vatican feast that had abandoned all pretense of holiness. Even courts known for their own decadence, where mistresses and power often mingled, expressed amazement at what had taken place in the Pope's palace. To them, this was excess beyond politics. It was sacrilege. For reformers already calling for change, the banquet became a gift. Men like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence had long thundered against Rome's corruption, warning that the church had become a harlot clothed in scarlet. Now, here was evidence so lurid it needed no embellishment. If the Vicar of Christ himself had presided over such a spectacle, what hope remained for the purity of Christendom? Yet, Alexander did not repent. If anything, he grew bolder. He seemed to take the scandal as proof of his invulnerability. The banquet had been witnessed, recorded, and whispered across Europe, but he still sat upon the papal throne. His enemies raged, but his power endured, and with Cesare still conquering cities in Italy, his dynasty appeared unstoppable. In some strange way, the scandal liberated him. The mask had been ripped away, and Alexander no longer bothered to wear it. He intensified the selling of indulgences, the auctioning of bishoprics, the accumulation of wealth. The papal palace glittered brighter, the entertainments grew louder,
the appetites more voracious. And yet, beneath this magnificence lurked decay. Even those who admired Caesare's brilliance as a commander could not help but see the family's name as poisoned. The Borgias had crossed the line, not just of morality, but of perception. They had become symbols, not merely of ambition, but of corruption incarnate. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not just an evening of debauchery. It was the crystallization of everything their enemies accused them of being. And from that night on, every move they made was shadowed by it.
The scandal of the Banquet of Chestnuts might have seemed survivable to Alexander VI. After all, he had endured whispers and denunciations for years. But history has a way of demanding its price. Even at the height of their triumph, the Borgias were already sowing the seeds of their ruin. In August of 1503, fate struck. Alexander fell suddenly ill after a banquet. Whether from malaria, poisoned wine, or his own excess remains a matter of debate. Rumors swirled that the poison he intended for another had instead been consumed by him. What is certain is that the once mighty pontiff, the man who had outmaneuvered kings and reshaped Rome in his family's image, was reduced to a dying shell within days. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI was dead. His death was followed by chaos. The Pope's body, swollen and discolored, was said to exude a stench so foul that even those charged with preparing it recoiled. Rome, which had once lit torches in his honor, now lit them to celebrate his passing. The man who had ruled as patriarch of the Borgias left behind not reverence but revulsion. For Cesare, the timing was catastrophic. His entire career, his armies, his dominion had been tethered to his father's throne. Without Alexander, his authority crumbled. Allies deserted him, enemies sharpened their daggers, and within months he was stripped of command. The man who had been Machiavelli's ideal prince, who had terrified Italy with his cunning, was reduced to a wandering exile. In 1507, he met his end not in triumph, but in obscurity, cut down as a mercenary in Spain, his body left on the battlefield, far from the palaces he once dreamed of ruling. Lucrezia fared differently. Married off once more, she became Duchess of Ferrara. In her new role, she cultivated the image of a virtuous and capable ruler, winning admiration as a patron of the arts. But no matter her efforts, the shadow of her family clung to her. To many, she remained the daughter of Alexander VI, the sister of Cesare, the pawn who had once sat silently beside her father at the most infamous banquet in papal history. The new pope, Julius II, wasted no time distancing himself from his predecessor. He refused to occupy the Borgia apartments, declaring them tainted. Instead, he commissioned Raphael to paint frescoes in new chambers above them, artworks of sublime beauty meant to cleanse the Vatican of the stain Alexander had left behind. The very walls of the Apostolic Palace became a repudiation of the Borgias, a monument to both their corruption and their erasure. Thus, the Borgia Empire, built on scandal, simony, and the sword, collapsed as swiftly as it had risen. Their name became synonymous not with dynasty, but with disgrace. And at the heart of that infamy stood the memory of one night, when chestnuts rolled across the marble floors of the Vatican and the papacy itself seemed to crumble under the weight of its own corruption.
With the death of Alexander VI and the scattering of his children's fortunes, the Borgias passed into legend. But legend has a way of reshaping truth, twisting fact into myth until the two become inseparable. For centuries, the story of the Banquet of Chestnuts lingered like a ghost in the Vatican, whispered with both horror and fascination. The scandal was preserved not in the fiery rhetoric of enemies, but in the dry, clinical notes of Johann Burchard. His Liber Notarum contained no moral outrage, no purple flourish, only fact laid bare. He recorded the banquet with the same detached precision with which he recorded coronations and councils. It was this very flatness that gave the account its terrible weight. But for later historians, the question remained, could such a thing truly have happened?
Catholic scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries often resisted the story, arguing that the document had been exaggerated or corrupted by enemies of the Church. It seemed unthinkable that the Vicar of Christ could preside over such a spectacle. To them, Burchard must have been misinterpreted, or interpolations must have crept into his text. Protestant historians, however, embraced the tale. To them, it was proof made flesh, the Catholic hierarchy exposed in its corruption, the papacy laid bare as the whore of Babylon their reformers had long proclaimed. They seized on the banquet as evidence that Martin Luther's fury was not only justified, but inevitable. Modern scholars tend to strike a middle path. Most accept that Burchard's account is essentially accurate, while noting that spectacles of prostitution and excess were not unique to the papal court. Renaissance princes across Italy hosted similar displays. What made this banquet singularly scandalous was not that it occurred, but that it occurred within the Vatican itself. A pope, his children, his cardinals, his palace, these were symbols meant to embody holiness. When instead they embodied Rome's darkest appetites, the contradiction was too powerful to ignore. Even the architecture deepened the irony. Pinturicchio's frescoes depicting saints and scenes from Christian history looked down from the walls as courtesans crawled naked on marble floors. Pagan gods and holy martyrs alike became silent witnesses to a spectacle that mocked them both. The Vatican itself seemed to recognize the weight of this shame. For centuries, Burchard's diary was locked away in the secret archives, consulted only by select scholars. When Pope Leo XIII opened the archives in the late 19th century, he hesitated to release Burchard's notes, fearing that their contents would disgrace the Church anew. That caution alone speaks volumes. 4 centuries later, the Borgias still haunted Rome. The Banquet of Chestnuts thus lived on not merely as an episode of depravity, but as a mirror held up to the eternal tension between sacred authority and human desire. It was not just a night of scandal. It was a symbol, a parable in flesh and wine, chestnuts and candlelight. And history has judged it accordingly.
The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than a lurid anecdote. It was the embodiment of everything that reformers had long suspected about Rome. To many across Europe, the Night of Chestnuts became the living proof that the papacy was no longer God's house on earth, but a stage for lust, greed, and tyranny. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he may not have mentioned the Borgias by name, but the stench of their papacy lingered in every accusation he made. How could indulgences be holy when they had been sold to fund Cesare's wars? How could the Pope be Christ's vicar when his palace had hosted contests of fornication? The Borgias, even in death, gave weight to the Protestant revolt. The Catholic Church itself could not ignore the rot. In the decades that followed, the Council of Trent sought to sweep away the shame left by Alexander VI. Clerical discipline was tightened, seminaries established, and the sale of offices condemned. The papacy wrapped itself once more in ritual and majesty, building a wall of Baroque splendor to disguise the scars of the Renaissance. The Borgias had shown what happened when the sacred was left unguarded, and Rome resolved never again to leave itself so vulnerable. But reform came at a cost. The spontaneity and worldly magnificence of Alexander's court gave way to a church increasingly defined by spectacle of another kind, ornamented, controlled, theatrical, designed to awe but never again to scandalize. Where Alexander reveled in chaos, his successors sought dignity in rigid order. And yet, the contradiction at the heart of Catholicism remained. The faithful continued to believe, to kneel at altars, to seek salvation. The sacraments functioned as they always had, untouched by the private sins of those who administered them. Ordinary believers distinguished between the frailty of men and the eternity of the divine. That separation, fragile but enduring, was perhaps the Church's greatest survival. Still, the Banquet of Chestnuts remained as a scar, an undeniable reminder of what happens when power escapes the leash of morality. Even centuries later, artists, writers, and historians return to it, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. It became a symbol not just of the Borgias, but of the eternal danger of corruption in institutions meant to embody virtue. In the end, the legacy of that night was not confined to the marble chambers of the Vatican. It spilled outward, shaping both Protestant defiance and Catholic reform. The chestnuts that once rolled across the floor became seeds of transformation, bitter, scandalous, and yet fruitful in ways no one present that night could have foreseen.